When we talk about the concept of democracy today, it's not just about the freedom of voting. And also, to a large extent, more and more people today across the world are paying attention, especially to this international relations. Given the fact that what happened in one country has direct impact to the neighboring countries as well. Previously, if you follow our show, that we've been addressing this ongoing political and social unrest within the country of Syria. I remember the first time I ever set my foot in the nation of Syria, and specifically the capital of Syria, Damascus. I will never forget that the people talked to me regarding their hope and also their dreams to become one democratic country. Well, again, right now we're in the year of 2023. How should we understand the democratic system within the nation of Syria? Or the better question we need to ask today is it still too late to address this question today? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, which is Dr. Kristian Ulrichsen. Again, Dr. Ulrichsen is the fellow for the Middle East at Rest University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, and his research spans on the history and the political and international political economy, and also the international relations of the Gulf states and their changing position within the global order. Well, Dr. Ulrichsen, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thank you for having me back.
Well, again, Dr. Ulrichsen, I want to get started based on the latest news that Syria's foreign minister has visited Saudi Arabia for the first time in more than a decade. And of course, we know that previously Syria was suspended from the Pan-Arab Organization in 2012 after Assad's brutal crackdown on a popular uprising triggered the outbreak of civil war that devastated the country. Now, help us to understand the significance regarding the Syria's foreign minister visitation to Saudi Arabia, and also how should we understand the current unsocial rest in Syria today? What do you say to that?
Well, as you know, the uprising began in 2011, and large parts of Syria fell out of government control. And initially, several of the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, many people in Kuwait were supporting groups of the opposition. And there were many different groups. They weren't all supporting the same ones, which contributed to a fragmentation of the opposition movement. It was difficult to align and unify all the opposition groups into one anti-government movement. And of course, over time, elements of the opposition radicalized, became more extreme in their own terms. We obviously culminated in the rise of the Islamic State in 2013, 2014, which really changed the nature of the Syrian conflict to some extent. We had obviously the US expressing concern by 2014 at the direction which some of the policy was going. We had the Gulf states really stepping back from providing support, financial and other logistical support to the opposition by about 2014, especially once Islamic State became an issue of global concern. And really then in 2015, the Russians intervened on behalf of the Assad regime and quite decisively shifted the balance back in favor of the Assad regime, which has been able to some extent, to reimpose its authoritarian control over much of, but not all of Syria. And so what we've seen over the last couple of years, I'd say since 2020, has been cautious attempts by some of the states in the Middle East, UAE especially, also Oman, to some extent Bahrain as well, in the Gulf, to, I guess, adapt to the reality where, in their view, Assad has sort of won this decade-long civil war, and they're trying to reintegrate, or at least kind of find ways of working with him once again. Now, the significance of the most recent moves with Saudi Arabia is that Saudi Arabia is the most powerful country in the Middle East right now. And it's one thing if Assad goes to Abu Dhabi and Dubai, which he did last year and again just a couple of weeks ago. It's one thing if he goes to Oman to meet the Sultan of Oman, which he did last month. But the big prize, in a sense, is Saudi Arabia. We have an Arab League summit coming up in Saudi Arabia in May. As you say, with the Arab League has suspended Syria since 2012. And
that's right.
There's at least a sense that Saudi Arabia is trying to rally a consensus within the Arab League for Syria's readmission. It may not be as easy as that. There are certainly countries like Qatar, Kuwait, and several other countries that are believed to be against any reintegration, any normalization with the Assad regime, or at least any normalization without political conditions, which would include serious negotiations and rehabilitation of opposition groups in Syria. So that's where we stand. But the significance is that Saudi Arabia is sort of the big prize in terms of re-establishing diplomatic relations, not only because of their size, but also because of the upcoming Arab League meeting as well in May.
Professor, I want to read something to you and also want to get your reaction on this. Again, as we mentioned before, the Syria's foreign minister has visited the Saudi Arabia. Now, according to the statement, or what we call a joint statement issued between the two countries, now this is what was said at the press conference, that the foreign ministers discussed the necessary steps to find a comprehensive political resolution to the Syrian crisis that would achieve national reconciliation and also contribute to the return of the Syria to the Arab League. Now, again, help us to understand, what does that mean that when we say that in order to guarantee that Syria's seat at the Arab League, how much can we trust the joint statement at this moment? And also, meanwhile, why should we be so concerned regarding the role of Syria when we talk about this entire Arab League? What is the significance behind that?
Well, the significance is the Arab League is the main pan-Arab organization, and obviously Syria's readmission into that body would send a very powerful signal that everything that has happened since 2011, 2012 has now come to an end, and that we're now into a new phase in this decade-long conflict. Obviously, the earthquake which hit Syria and southern Turkey on the 6th of February has also changed, to some extent, the dynamic. We've seen a lot of new sort of, flights of aid and humanitarian supplies. And of course, a lot of the areas in northern Syria are still believed to be at least aligned with non-government forces. And so there's also a humanitarian dimension, and this could be a way of trying to talk about reconciliation, to use the earthquake and post-earthquake relief as a way to try and bring the parties closer together. But I mean, you talked about lack of trust, and obviously the Assad regime is not trusted as by many people within Syria, but also outside Syria, especially after what has happened over the last 12 years. And obviously the Assad regime doesn't necessarily want to engage with opposition groups that have spent the last 11, 12 years fighting against their control. So there's still, I think, an awful lot that would have to be done. My guess would be that the inclusion of the language of reconciliation, negotiation in the statement is a Saudi attempt to try to illustrate to the holdouts, the other states in the Arab League that don't yet want to re-engage with Syria. The Saudis are trying to push for concessions from the Syrians so they can then give to other Arab League members as a way of saying, look, we can readmit Syria, but there are conditions. It's not a blank check. This isn't just simply a return to the status quo ante of 2011 as if nothing has happened. So I think the Saudis are trying to find a way to sell this to other states that don't yet want to work with Syria.
That's right, Professor. Again, we know that today, when we look at this members of the Arab League, at least, statistically speaking, at least there are 5 members within this league strongly opposed the re-enjoyment of Syria. For example, we're looking at Kuwait and Qatar and Yemen and Morocco. And again, help us to understand, was by readmitting Syria coming back to the Arab League, was this a political or social or even perhaps economic compromise? So in other words, the whole world today is we're looking at this globalization, and the whole world today we are paying attention to this economic agenda. So by admitting Syria coming back to this Arab League, what is the ultimate purpose of doing that?
Well, from a Syrian regime government point of view, the purpose is to signal that Syria is back in the fold diplomatically, that they are now accepted again as an actor in regional affairs, that the isolation of Syria that we've seen over the last 12 years is now over. So you can see the benefits to the Assad family of being rehabilitated. Now, obviously, there are elements in the Arab League that are still very hesitant about that, just because of the brutality or the horrific circumstances of the last 12 years. And that's where I think there's a feeling in some of the countries that Syria cannot just be given a blank check to return. That any return has to be accompanied by real conditions and real progress on achieving some sort of reconciliation, but not necessarily completely on the terms set by the government, because obviously we have seen a sustained period of contestation in Syria, where a lot of people have been extremely active in trying to reject the Assad regime, and the Assad regime, in return, has been extremely perhaps violent in some of its responses. So with that in mind, I think there is a mood in some of the states in the Arab League to make sure that were Syria to be given this significant diplomatic win, which it would be if they were allowed to come back into the fold, that is then tied to some sort of meaningful concession or compromise. As you say, compromise is going to be difficult to achieve, but there's certainly a feeling that they don't want there to be nothing in return. They want to have something to show for readmitting Syria.
Professor, I want to get your reaction to talk about another country which is related to Syria as well, which is the nation of Iran. Again, when we look at the current political and social status of Iran, needless to say, this country is also facing some major political setback at the same time. Again, given the fact today, based on the latest news, that the current regime requires women, again, to dress, I want to put it in a mild way, is to dress according to the rules or dress according to the policy. But meanwhile, let's talk about the role of Iran today when it addressed the nation of Syria. Professor, help us to understand what is the correlation between Syria and Iran today? And also, why should we be concerned about Iran when we're addressing the role of Syria in this Arab League? What do you say to that?
Well, I mean, the Iranian support for Syria goes back decades now, and certainly Syria has been seen to be part of Iran's so-called axis of resistance, the sort of anti-status quo movements in the Middle East that Iran has been carefully, or at least in their view, trying to assemble. And Syria has been part of this since at least the 1990s, probably before. And it's an important part of Iran's sort of cultivation of regional, not allies, but certainly regional partners. Certainly from a Sunni Arab point of view, in the 2000s, after the Iraq War, US invasion of Iraq, there was a talk of a Shia crescent that King Abdullah of Jordan sort of talked about in 2005, I think it was. And there was this view that you had Iran, Iraq with the Shia majority, and then Syria and Lebanon kind of constituting an arc of influence that had links to Iran. And obviously there were paramilitary links, and obviously in Lebanon with Hezbollah. And Iran was supporting groups such as Hezbollah, such as the Houthis in Yemen, and it certainly contributed to a feeling in Saudi Arabia and other states that they were being almost encircled by countries or movements with links to Iran and to various sort of revolutionary or certainly anti-status quo movements. So those links go back a long time. Iran has obviously stood by the Assad government over the past 12 years, and so that importance is increased. Obviously, Russia has now intervened in Syria since 2015. There was certainly maybe a feeling in Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states that actually if Russia could increase influence in Syria, then the influence of Iran could perhaps be marginalized or at least displaced. That hasn't necessarily happened, and we now see Iran supporting Russia in the war against Ukraine. So that hasn't maybe happened, but we also see in the wider region, we see Iran and Saudi Arabia now making quite concerted moves to restore their relations, and any reconciliation between Iran and Saudi Arabia could have knock-on effects across the Middle East. We've seen obviously a delegation of Hamas visiting Saudi Arabia this week as well. We've seen the Saudis talking to the Houthi movement in Yemen this past week. So I think anything at the broader level that can bring together the two main protagonists, Iran and Saudi Arabia, could have knock-on effects in trying to de-escalate points of tension in other parts of the Middle East as well.
Professor, I want to go back to the concept of democracy as we mentioned before. When we talk about this democratic system or the concept of democracy, of course, today that the whole world is rooting for the Syrian citizens. And given the fact today that the Western nations have thrown their support behind a UN resolution calling for a nationwide ceasefire in Syria and the safe passage for the Syrians displaced by the conflict. Now, again, Professor, help us to understand, when we look at the concept of democracy in Syria today, what are the significant points that we should understand under the Assad regime? Do we still have the availability, or do we have the opportunity to grasp the concept of democracy?
I don't think Syria has ever been a democracy, and I think if the Assad regime has anything to say, it will never be a democracy at all. And I think part of the dilemma, part of the problem is you have all of these millions of people who've been displaced either internally within Syria, they've either fled from government control to anti-government or areas or vice versa. And there are millions of Jews in neighboring states and now being resettled around the world. And the question is, would any of them feel safe and secure going back if there was any sort of reconciliation? This is the question. What happens to all the displaced people? Would they ever trust the government? And would the government be able and willing to actually create secure conditions? This is an issue, I think, that is probably more important for people to consider than whether a democratic Syria is likely. We've obviously seen elements of the opposition cast their support for sort of democratic movements, especially in title of their names, but they're not in a position of political power to make that happen. The only entity which has the political power in Syria to do that is the Assad regime, and they control the regime with an iron fist as much now as they did in the past. And so that, I think, is unlikely. I think what conditions can be imposed to secure trust and safe passage for displaced people, I think, is probably what matters more. And I get the sense that very few of the displaced Syrians right now would trust the Assad regime at all. So that's probably more of an issue to look for.
Professor Ulrichsen, I want to bring another country into our conversation when we talk about Syria, which is the nation of Tunisia. Now, we know that recently Tunisian president met recently with Syria's chief diplomats and also said that his country want to boost bilateral cooperation and preserve what we called historical ties of brotherhood with Damascus. Now, again, Dr. Ulrichsen, what do you make of this relationship? That, again, it's rather, on one hand, it's rather difficult to comprehend that Tunisians today are also facing this political and social unrest and setbacks. But meanwhile, for this nation is trying to build this brotherhood with Damascus. How should we comprehend that?
Yeah, it shows you just how far things have moved over the last couple of years. If you think back to 2011, 2012, as the world was horrified by the Assad regime's brutality in responding to the opposition in Syria, we were also inspired by the movement in Tunisia, which also produced the only real democratic outcome of the Arab Spring. Tunisia was a democracy. It did have peaceful transitions of political power. It's not just to have elections, but you need to have cycles of elections. You need the winners of the elections to then acknowledge when they don't win the election, they then transfer power. And we had that in Syria for a decade, in Tunisia for a decade. And obviously since 2021, the president has effectively monopolized political power. He's taken steps to dismantle alternative political groups. He's now arrested Rashid Ghannouchi, the former prime minister, leader of one of the biggest Islamist groups in Syria. And I mean, this backsliding, this sort of democratic backsliding, returning Tunisia to a sort of pre-2011 state of sort of personal rule and almost dictatorship is really quite something. And for him now to be talking in this way with Syria just goes to show how we've sort of always kind of come full circle. It's as if the last 12 years never happened, both in Syria and in Tunisia. We're back to a pre-2011, pre-Arab Spring situation where Assad ruled Syria with an iron fist, and Ben Ali ruled Tunisia again with an iron fist. And 12 years later, here we are, and the two countries are once again highly authoritarian. I mean, this is really quite something, and quite distressing in many ways, given what has happened in the meantime. But it's really quite a remarkable sort of turnaround.
Well, Professor, I'm very glad you mentioned the term. It's called authoritarian country. Again, when we look at the geopolitical change today, many countries that can be coined as authoritarianism. But again, when we look at the countries in the Middle East, we are looking at specifically some of the most obvious nations that can be also called as authoritarian nations. Now, Professor, coming to you again, I want to get your reaction on this. Is when we look at the Tunisia's leadership today, is swinging back and forth towards authoritarianism, and meanwhile, again, it's also reaching out to the nation of Syria. Now, help us to understand what is the definition of authoritarianism today, and also how much should we concerned, especially from this democratic perspective, concerned about those countries who are under this authoritarian regimes. What do you say to that, Professor?
I think you can look at a definition of authoritarianism by looking at what the Kais Saied, the president of Tunisia, has done since 2021. He's monopolized political power. He's arrested opposition political figures. He's not allowed the media to be a free media. He's taken control over the sort of legal system, the judicial system, the courts. Opposition or even independent and potentially autonomous centers of power have been stripped of their influence and taken under government control. And so an authoritarian system is where the ruling elite in power basically control all the leaders of that power and don't permit any autonomous or independent activity. And I think we've seen that over the last 2 years in Tunisia. And that, I think, is probably the clearest example of how, in this case, how quickly a country can move from maybe a fragile democracy, but still a democracy where you did have elections. It did produce democratic outcomes in terms of the party that won the election then being represented in government. And we've seen that all being systematically stripped away. So there's now, the political elite are now in prison, the media is not free, and there's no real possibility to challenge that through the courts either. So this, in a way, is sort of very typical of what would happen in an authoritarian setting.
Professor Ulrichsen, I want to wrap up our conversation by going back to the last question is, the question is very simple. What is the future for Syria in the long run? Because again, we will look at that since the involvement of the United States government, and also we'll look at more countries are very concerned about this freedom of speech and freedom of, any other given rights in Syria. But today, under the regime of Assad, everything has been stripped away by the regime, and the citizens are there are no doubt are suffering devastatedly and also tremendously. But meanwhile, looking ahead, we still need to talk about the future for the country. So again, Dr. Ulrichsen, what is the future for the country? Are we going to see any changes within the nation? And even better yet, is it time for the U.S. to re-engage with Assad or even this regime today in order to secure the freedom for the citizens? And what do you say to that, Professor?
Well, I think the US has shown so far that it's not prepared to re-engage with Assad, and that it doesn't view the actions of other states to re-engage with any favor. That said, it hasn't necessarily stopped that process of re-engagement taking place either. So I think there's a wait-and-see approach to see what happens, how far this kind of reintegration goes, especially with the Arab League. I think the future of Syria is much more about what happens in terms of putting real conditions on the Assad regime as a price for sort of reintegrating it. Can conditions be imposed? Would the Assad regime accept them? Would they comply? Would they abide by them? How would they be monitored? And then, of course, the other side of the equation, what happens if the regime, what happens to all the people in Syria who don't want to live under the Assad regime? Can there be a genuine reconciliation? And if so, would that be able to sort of re-house many of the displaced people? And right now, I think there's such a lack of trust and such a sort of feeling that this isn't going to happen and isn't possible. It's going to be a long and difficult process. But I think anything that can try to focus on political outcomes rather than military or sort of fighting, could be something. And of course, what kind of leverage could the maybe not the international community, because the US doesn't want to engage at this point, but what leverage can the regional states put on the Assad regime? Assad would clearly, I think, like to be readmitted to the Arab League. So what can they force him to give up? What kind of concession can they make him give? I think that's what we'll be looking for over the next few weeks, and especially up to the Arab League summit, which I think is the middle of May.
Well, very good, Professor. Again, I 100% agree with you. I think in May that we are going to look at this summit among the members within this Arab League. On one hand, it's crucial to pay attention to the role of Syria, and meanwhile to see this ongoing political and also this diplomatic engagement between some of the regional partners. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to speak to Dr. Kristian Ulrichsen. Again, Dr. Ulrichsen is the fellow for the Middle East at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. I strongly encourage everyone to follow Dr. Ulrichsen on social media and also, again, his publications. And I believe that you are going to receive a lot more insightful and meaningful analysis. But meanwhile, Professor Ulrichsen, thank you so much for taking your time to be on the show. It's been a pleasure, and we always appreciate your insights and analysis to our show. So thank you so much for doing this.
And thank you for having me.